Hello and welcome. My name is Alexander Kerry. You're watching Head to Head on UATV. Human rights violations are a very sensitive issue in Ukraine due to the ongoing war in eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. Now, to discuss this topic, we're joined in studio today by Waine Jordash, an international expert on human rights and criminal law. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So, first question. Recently, the Ukrainian government passed a law on reintegration on Donbas. It has been a controversial law. It had been criticized on many sides, but does it really protect Ukrainian citizens today in these occupied territories, and how does it do it?
I think to an extent it does, actually. I was involved in different ways in the process of that draft coming to being. Not that I had anything to do with that final draft, other than commenting on behalf of some civil society and also some MPs. And actually, the final product, I was surprised, was it took into account many of the concerns which I had observed along the way, which was that it sought to regulate, but without actually providing the means by which individuals in the occupied territories could, in fact, have their rights protected. And so, to an extent, I think what it does is it recognises that the reality, which is simply because those territories may or may not be occupied, and it's debatable.
So it puts names on things, you mean?
It puts, well, Ukraine has a number of rights obligations. In Crimea, they are significantly less because it's obvious that the Russian Federation is in occupation, but it still has obligations. In relation to the East, it's the situation of how much control the separatists have and how much control the Russians have is a question of debate, and that means Ukraine's obligations are also a question of debate. The most important thing is, though, that Ukraine still has obligations, and it must take whatever measures are possible in relation to protecting the human rights of citizens in the East and also in Crimea. And I think what the bill does is start the process of recognising that. It doesn't go far enough. It needs to be more specific in relation to what those rights are, and it needs to ensure that those rights are applicable in a range of different spheres. So anything to do with, from the right to life to all the way to socio-economic and cultural rights, such as the right to work, the right to welfare, the right to benefits, and so on, are adequately protected. So it's a springboard, but it doesn't go far enough in my view.
Now, it is interesting that you raised the idea of benefits, because while this law on the reintegration of Donbas passed, there has been this trial where Ukrainians in control and now occupied territories went to ask for benefits from the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian government couldn't provide it. So my question would be, realistically, on the field, how these rights are respected? How to apply these rights realistically?
Well, it's a very good question, because it's obviously not straightforward, especially when you're talking about economic rights, because, well, Ukraine cannot give what it doesn't have. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there's always going to be a question of where the obligations lie. So, and then once that's been decided, how practically you're going to make sure that not only are the rights of those citizens upheld, but also Ukraine is able to exercise its sovereign right, and it has rights, obviously, to security. If it feels or comes to a reasoned conclusion that the money that it's given to citizens in the occupied territory are in fact going to finance the separatist military machine, then it has rights in relation to that. So what's needed, I think, is a fact-finding exercise which is conducted on an ongoing basis, where there is monitoring of rights violations and rights which are not being fulfilled. And this process of fact-finding can base sensible policy which balances those sovereign rights that Ukraine has against its obligations to provide for its civilians in those territories. What it cannot do, what Ukraine cannot do, is simply say, well, all of those people in those territories, they're no longer part of Ukraine.
Yeah, make them second-zone citizens.
Yes,
yeah.
They can't. I mean, sensible policy, sensible decisions, fact-finding on an ongoing basis, so that what happens today is reviewed on a constant basis, so that we see if decisions are made now and whether they're still the correct decisions in 6 months' time.
Now, Ukraine has now recently started its turn on the Human Rights Council. And Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said on Twitter, and I quote, and I guess we'll see it on the screen right now, protecting human rights around the world, including in the temporarily occupied Crimea and Donbas, is our priority. How does the fact that how does being in the UN Human Rights Council help in these territories?
Well, I think I mean, it's hard to be concrete, but what I can say is that the more Ukraine participates in these international governance-type organizations, and I include within that, for example, the International Criminal Court. At the moment, Ukraine has made declarations which provide the jurisdiction to the ICC, but what it hasn't done is ratify the Rome Statute. If it ratifies the Rome Statute, it's in the room when international justice is being defined for the future. It has a chance to lobby for the type of law, for the type of policies that are of use to Ukraine. If it's not in the room, we can't do that. And the Human Rights Council is another example of that. What I've been working on and off in Ukraine for a couple of years, and I think there's some fantastic human rights work being done, both by civil society, by the prosecution agencies. For example, the Crimean prosecutor, he's doing fantastic work in very difficult circumstances. What is needed, I think, beyond individuals like the Crimean prosecutor doing this excellent work, is a joined-up approach by government, which tries to put forward a strategy of human rights fulfillment and engagement within international organizations, which is joined up and coherent, and which, when opportunities arise, for example, when Ukraine is in the Human Rights Council, it can present that joined up work to its international partners.
So it's interesting that you raise this issue, because yes, civil rights society seems like a pillar of human rights protection in Ukraine, and how to ensure that the government follows this civil society and just doesn't just rely on civil society saying, see, we have this civil society, and well, there's no need to do more efforts.
Well, I think it does this by number one, recognizing that it's the ultimate guarantor of human rights, not civil society. The fact is that international partners will listen to the government more than they will civil society, and that's, rightly or wrongly, that's the reality. But more than that, what it needs to do is, I think Ukraine needs to work with civil society. And I'm going to go back to the Crimean prosecutor again, because what he does, and I think this is exactly what should be happening, is he invites civil society into his office to work hand in hand with them. Now, that ultimately is the best approach, that it should be a government and non-government approach working together to present its best face, Ukraine's best face, to its international partners. Let me give an example with the International Criminal Court. The best communications to the International Criminal Court are not government doing one thing and civil society doing another. They are combining the best of both.
Presenting a united
yes,
front.
because they both bring different things to the table, and together they're better than separate. And I think that the Crimean prosecutor is doing a great job at doing that and recognizing that essential need. And I think Ukraine needs to, recognize this joined-up approach is the best one.
Now, you spoke about Crimea, and well, let's say that Russia is not well known for listening when it comes to human rights violation, to say the least. How to ensure economic sanctions exist, of course, but how to ensure that Russia is made accountable and Russian de facto authorities in Crimea, for example, are made accountable for what's happening right now in Crimea?
I mean, it's a difficult, it's a good question, and it's a difficult answer, and it's a long-term answer. There are no easy solutions. That's obvious. I mean, if you're talking about the International Criminal Court, no time soon are we going to see any Russian Federation suspects in the dock in The Hague. That's obvious. But long term, that's not necessarily an unrealistic expectation. And I think the arm of international justice is a long one. And if you look at its success over the last 25 years in terms of obtaining their suspects and putting them on trial, it's pretty effective.
Most, if we think former Yugoslavia, for example, like one of them. For
example, Mladic and Karadzic, these were senior Bosnian Serbs who were wanted for over 15 years, and eventually they were caught. Things change. Things will change in Russia. Suspects which seem out of reach now may well be in reach later. But the reality is that, it's going to be a long-term project, and, Ukraine's taking some very useful steps in terms of, applying using the International the European Court of Human Rights, applying using the International Court of Justice, and applying using the International Criminal Court. And what it must do is, and also, of course, with sanctions, I mean, what it must do is apply itself vigorously to all of these different forms of international accountability and international awareness building, and maintain, as difficult as it may be, the determination to keep going, however imperfect these mechanisms are. These are mechanisms which 50 years ago they didn't exist. We are actually in quite a much better position than we were 50 years ago. Imperfect they may be, but they're the things that are on the table. And actually, in the end, it may take a long time. We may be pleasantly surprised.
And we will closely follow up the developments around this topic. Thank you very much for coming in our studio today. It was a pleasure to have this interview with you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
That was Waine Jordash, international human rights and criminal law expert. Thank you for watching the program. Stay tuned for the rest.